Before anything else, the same check I run on every one of these. If you were sent here by a video claiming Grok AI was asked why the US military has been in direct contact with aliens since 1947 and gave some kind of shocking confirmation, that specific claim isn't real. I found the same template, nearly word for word, attached to at least half a dozen different videos across different channels over the past several months. Some about first contact modeling, some about a supposed MIT experiment. None of them citing an actual verifiable Grok conversation. Anyone can go check for themselves. That's the fabricated part. Here's what isn't fabricated, and it's genuinely one of the strangest, most well-documented runs of official government behavior in modern American history. Since 1947, the United States military and intelligence community really has run a continuous, evolving, sometimes secretive series of programs specifically dedicated to investigating unidentified objects in American airspace, right up through a sitting Air Force officer testifying under oath before Congress in 2023 that non-human biological material had been recovered from crash sites. None of that requires an invented AI moment. It's already on the congressional record. Let's start exactly where this story actually starts, on June 24th, 1947, 3 weeks before the incident everyone associates with this topic. A civilian pilot named Kenneth Arnold was flying near Mount Rainier in Washington state when he reported seeing 9 crescent-shaped objects moving at what he estimated to be extraordinary speed. And when a newspaper reporter wrote up his account, he described their motion as like a saucer if you skipped it across water, a phrase editors shortened into flying saucer, a term that exploded across American media within days and effectively invented the entire cultural category this story lives inside. Within weeks, newspapers across the country were flooded with copycat sightings, and the United States, barely 2 years removed from the end of World War II and already sliding into Cold War tension with the Soviet Union, found itself in the middle of what historians now call the 1947 flying disc craze. Then, on July 8, 1947, the Roswell Army Airfield in New Mexico issued an official press release stating that personnel had recovered the wreckage of a crashed flying disc from a nearby ranch. For about 24 hours, this was a real, official, on-the-record announcement from the United States military. Then, just as quickly, the Army reversed itself, holding a press conference the same day where officials displayed wreckage they now identified as a conventional weather balloon, and the story faded from national attention for decades. It resurfaced dramatically in the late 1970s and through the 1980s, driven by a wave of books and interviews with witnesses, including former intelligence officer Jesse Marcel, who had helped recover the original debris, and later stated publicly that he believed what he'd handled was not, in fact, an ordinary weather balloon. Describing material with unusual properties, he struggled to characterize using conventional terms. The real explanation, once the government finally addressed it directly decades later, turned out to be genuinely fascinating on its own terms, even without aliens involved. In the mid-1990s, facing renewed public and congressional pressure, the Air Force conducted a formal review and released 2 reports, in 1994 and again in 1997, concluding that the Roswell wreckage actually came from Project Mogul, a highly classified program using high-altitude balloon arrays fitted with sensitive acoustic sensors, designed specifically to detect sound waves from Soviet nuclear weapons tests from a great distance, at a time when the United States had no other reliable way to monitor Soviet nuclear development. Because Project Mogul was classified at a level higher than the officers on the ground at Roswell were cleared to know about, the Air Force report concluded that the original recovery personnel genuinely didn't know what they were looking at, which is why the initial press release described it as a flying disc, and why the units sent to investigate afterward were instructed to publicly reclassify it as an ordinary weather balloon rather than reveal the actual classified nuclear detection program behind it. In other words, according to the government's own later account, the original Roswell cover story wasn't covering up aliens. It was covering up a different, entirely earthbound secret, early Cold War nuclear surveillance technology, using a cover story so effective it accidentally created one of the most enduring conspiracy narratives in American history. The formal government investigation machinery that grew out of this period is itself worth walking through in detail, because it's real, it's well documented, and it ran continuously under various names for the next several decades. In 1948, the Air Force established Project Sign specifically to investigate UFO reports, which was replaced in 1949 by Project Grudge, which in turn was replaced in 1952 by the most famous of these programs, Project Blue Book, which ran until 1969 and ultimately compiled records on over 12,000 individual UFO sightings. In 1953, a CIA-convened panel known as the Robertson Panel reviewed the evidence collected and concluded that the overwhelming majority of sightings had mundane explanations, weather phenomena, aircraft, astronomical objects, and hoaxes, while also expressing concern that continued public fascination with UFOs posed what they described as a potential national security risk, not because aliens were real, but because a public condition to report and panic over unexplained aerial phenomena could theoretically be exploited or could clog genuine defense reporting channels during an actual crisis. Project Blue Book was ultimately closed following a 1968 independent scientific review known as the Condon Report, commissioned by the Air Force and led by physicist Edward Condon at the University of Colorado, which concluded there was no evidence UFOs represented anything beyond conventional explanations, or, in a small percentage of cases, genuinely unexplained but not necessarily extraordinary phenomena, and recommended no further dedicated government study was scientifically justified. That should have been the end of the story, institutionally speaking, and for nearly 40 years, it largely was, at least publicly. Then, in December of 2017, the New York Times published a story that fundamentally reopened this entire subject at the highest levels of government, revealing the existence of a Pentagon program called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, commonly known as AATIP, which had operated with congressional funding from around 2007 to 2012, championed in part by then Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, and had reportedly investigated reports of unidentified aircraft displaying flight characteristics, extreme acceleration, sudden directional changes, and sustained hypersonic speeds without visible propulsion or sonic booms that the program's investigators argued exceeded any known human aerospace technology. The same reporting introduced the public to Luis Elizondo, a former military intelligence officer who said he had run the program and resigned from the Pentagon in protest over what he described as excessive internal secrecy and resistance to taking the subject seriously, and released alongside the story were 3 now famous cockpit videos from Navy fighter jets, showing objects nicknamed for their appearance, including the Tic Tac, filmed off the coast of California in 2004 during an encounter directly witnessed and later publicly described in detail by retired Navy Commander David Fravor, who reported his squadron's radar and visual tracking recorded an oblong white object performing maneuvers he characterized as far beyond the capability of any aircraft in the world at that time. What makes the Nimitz encounter specifically worth understanding, beyond the viral cockpit footage, is that it wasn't a single grainy video taken by one confused pilot. Multiple aircraft, ship-based radar systems, and infrared targeting pods reportedly tracked the same object across an extended encounter, generating a body of instrument data that investigators, both military and later civilian, have spent years attempting to analyze and explain, with the Navy itself eventually confirming in 2019 that the footage was authentic, that the objects depicted remained officially unidentified, a very different statement from confirming they were extraterrestrial, but a meaningful acknowledgement that conventional explanations hadn't been established either. This renewed institutional attention led directly to the government reestablishing formal UFO investigation infrastructure, something that hadn't existed since Project Blue Book closed decades earlier. AATIP's successor, the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force, was established within the Navy in 2017, and in June of 2021, under direct congressional mandate, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released a public preliminary assessment examining 144 reported incidents involving military aircraft between 2004 and 2021. The report's actual conclusions were considerably more restrained than most viral coverage suggested at the time, stating explicitly that the government lacked sufficient data to make any confident determination about the nature of most of these objects, while noting that one incident had a likely mundane explanation, a large deflating balloon, and offering several potential categories. Investigators believed most cases likely fell into, ranging from airborne clutter and natural atmospheric phenomena to classified U.S. government or foreign adversary technology, while conspicuously declining to rule out or endorse an extraterrestrial explanation for a small residual category of cases that resisted. This entire institutional trajectory sets the stage for the moment your video title is almost certainly, if distantly, referring to, because it is the closest thing to an actual on-the-record government statement anywhere near the claim these fabricated AI videos are built around. On July the 26th, 2023, the House Oversight Committee held a formal televised congressional hearing titled Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena: Implications on National Security, Public Safety, and Government Transparency. 3 witnesses testified under oath. Ryan Graves, a former Navy pilot who had personally reported encountering unexplained objects during training missions off the East Coast. David Fravor, the retired commander from the 2004 Nimitz encounter. And David Grush, a decorated Air Force veteran and former intelligence officer who had served as the National Reconnaissance Office's representative to the government's own UAP task force before leaving government service in April of that year. Grush's testimony is, without exaggeration, one of the most extraordinary things ever said under oath before the United States Congress. And it happened in full public view, on camera, recorded in the congressional record, requiring absolutely no chatbot to reveal it. Grush testified that the United States had operated a secret, multi-decade program involved in the retrieval and attempted reverse engineering of vehicles of what he called non-human origin. When Republican Representative Nancy Mace directly asked him whether the United States possessed bodies of pilots from any recovered craft, Grush answered that biologics had come with some of these recoveries. When pressed further on whether those biologics were human or non-human, he confirmed under oath that they were described to him as non-human. Grush stated his information came not from direct personal observation, since he testified he had not personally seen any craft or biological remains himself, but from more than 40 witnesses he said he interviewed over 4 years in his official government role. Individuals he described as having, in his words, a long-standing track record of legitimacy and service to this country, and he stated that further specifics could only be discussed in a classified setting, a sensitive compartmented information facility, rather than in open public testimony. This is where an honest telling of this story has to slow down and be genuinely careful, because what happened after Grush's testimony matters just as much as the testimony itself, and it's routinely left out of the viral version of this story entirely. The Pentagon's own dedicated investigative body, RO, responded to these specific claims directly and on the record. A Pentagon spokesperson stated at the time that ORO had not discovered any verifiable information to substantiate claims that any program regarding the possession or reverse engineering of extraterrestrial materials had existed in the past or currently existed. This wasn't a passing dismissal. In March of 2024, RO released a lengthy, formal historical report, the product of an extensive review of government records stretching back to 1945, that directly examined dozens of specific claims, including allegations connected to Roswell and to claims resembling Grush's, and concluded it had found no verifiable evidence that the United States government or any private entity had ever possessed a retrieved extraterrestrial craft or technology derived from one. Attributing many of the specific historical claims, investigators examined to a combination of misidentified conventional or classified military technology, genuine understandable confusion during the pressures of the Cold War era, and in some traced instances, deliberately circulated hoaxes and rumors that had calcified into accepted lore within a small, tightly networked UFO research community over decades, some of it reportedly originating from individuals later found to have fabricated or embellished their claimed government service and access. Independent academic critics, including physicists who reviewed Grush's testimony afterward, pointed out publicly that his account, however sincerely delivered, rested entirely on second-hand and third-hand testimony from unnamed sources, rather than any physical evidence, documentation, or verifiable data that Grush himself had directly examined, a distinction Grush's own testimony acknowledged when he repeatedly stated he was relaying what others had told him rather than describing first-hand knowledge. None of this means Grush was necessarily lying, and it doesn't mean ARO's conclusions definitively close the case either, and being honest about this story means resisting the urge to hand you a tidy verdict in either direction the way a fabricated AI video would. What it does mean is that the actual state of this issue, as of the most recent official government findings, is a direct, public, unresolved conflict between a credentialed former intelligence officer's sworn congressional testimony describing a hidden, non-human recovery program, and the Pentagon's own dedicated investigative office stating flatly that it has found no verifiable evidence any such program ever existed, with each side's supporters accusing the other of either an active cover-up or of chasing decades-old, thoroughly discredited rumors dressed up in new, more credible-seeming packaging. That genuine, still simmering institutional conflict, playing out through official government channels, congressional hearings, and formal published reports, is a far stranger and more legitimately unresolved story than anything a fabricated chatbot quote could add to it. It's worth mentioning one more thread in this story specifically, because it explains where a significant amount of the funding and cultural momentum behind the AI tip era actually came from, since it's rarely mentioned in the viral retellings. Robert Bigelow, a wealthy aerospace entrepreneur and hotel industry figure, funded a substantial portion of ATIP's early research work through his aerospace company. And Bigelow has separately spoken publicly and extensively about his personal belief in UFOs and extraterrestrial life, including his ownership and funding of research at a Utah property known as Skinwalker Ranch, a site associated with decades of reported paranormal and UFO activity that Bigelow's research teams investigated, using sensor equipment and scientific personnel, producing results that remain, like most of this broader subject, genuinely disputed rather than conclusively. either confirmed or debunked by independent researchers outside Bigelow's own funded teams. Separately, musician-turned-UFO researcher Tom DeLonge, formerly of the band Blink-182, founded an organization called To the Stars, Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2017, specifically to pursue declassification of government UFO-related information, and individuals connected to that organization, including Elizondo himself for a period, played a documented role in bringing the AA tip story to the New York Times in the first place, meaning the entire chain of events leading to Grush's 2023 congressional testimony traces back through a genuinely unusual mixture of Pentagon insiders, a billionaire hotel magnate, and a rock musician, a detail so strange it barely needs any embellishment to sound like fiction. There's an important piece of forged evidence worth addressing directly, because it sits at the foundation of a huge amount of modern UFO conspiracy literature and gets treated as legitimate far more often than it deserves. In 1984, a set of documents surfaced claiming to be briefing papers for a secret committee called Majestic 12, supposedly established by President Truman in 1947, specifically to manage the recovery and cover-up of the Roswell crash and ongoing extraterrestrial contact. These documents circulated for years within UFO research circles, presented as the single most direct documentary proof of an official alien cover-up ever produced. The FBI investigated the documents directly, and document examiners, along with independent forensic analysis of the typefaces, letterhead formatting, and signature reproductions used, concluded the materials were fabricated, with several telltale anachronisms identified, including a date format inconsistent with genuine documents from that era of the Truman administration, and a forged signature that appeared to be traced directly from an authentic but unrelated Truman letter. Even prominent UFO researchers who spent years investigating the Majestic 12 documents, including several who initially championed their authenticity, eventually concluded independently that they were a hoax, though the documents continue circulating today, often stripped of that established forensic history, across exactly the kind of content that also produces fabricated AI verdict videos. Area 51 deserves its own honest explanation here too, because it's arguably done more to shape the modern popular image of secret government alien technology than any single other location, and the real history behind it is almost more interesting than the myth. The facility, formerly part of the Nevada Test and Training Range near Groom Lake, was for decades one of the most highly classified sites in the entire U.S. defense apparatus, its existence not even officially acknowledged by the government until a declassification of CIA historical documents in 2013. What the site was actually used for, according to those declassified records, was testing genuinely revolutionary, at the time, genuinely secret, human-built aircraft, including the U-2 spy plane in the 1950s, the even faster and higher flying A-12 and its successor, the SR-71 Blackbird in the 1960s, and later stealth aircraft including the F-117 Nighthawk. Test pilots flying these aircraft, which had radical unfamiliar silhouettes, unusual lighting configurations, and flight profiles far beyond anything in public aviation at the time, were frequently spotted by civilian pilots and residents in the surrounding Nevada desert, generating a steady stream of UFO reports throughout the Cold War that were, according to the CIA's own declassified history, in many specific documented instances, actually classified domestic test flights rather than anything extraterrestrial, with the government's blanket policy of neither confirming nor denying the base's existence at the time, inadvertently fueling decades of alien conspiracy content, rather than the mundane, if still highly sensitive national security explanation actually behind many individual sightings. Betty and Barney Hill's case from September of 1961 is worth including as well, because it's widely credited as the first heavily publicized alien abduction account in American culture and set the template, strange lost time, medical examination narratives, recovered memory through hypnosis, that countless later reported abduction accounts would follow. The Hills, a married New Hampshire couple, reported witnessing an unexplained light in the sky while driving home late at night, followed by a period of time they couldn't account for, and under hypnosis sessions, conducted by a psychiatrist in the years that followed, both separately described detailed memories of being taken aboard a craft and physically examined by humanoid beings. Their case received massive national attention through a 1966 best-selling book and a 1975 television film, and it remains genuinely disputed among researchers today, with skeptics pointing to the well-documented unreliability of memories recovered specifically through hypnosis, a technique now understood by psychologists to be prone to inadvertently implanting false details rather than reliably excavating suppressed true ones, while believers point to consistencies between the couple's separately recorded hypnosis sessions as evidence against simple fabrication. Either way, the Hill case fundamentally shaped how nearly every subsequent reported abduction account in American culture would be structured and described, making it arguably one of the most culturally influential UFO stories in this entire 70-plus year history, regardless of what actually happened that night on a New Hampshire highway. A handful of other cases round out the picture and are worth knowing simply because they keep recurring across decades of UFO documentaries and, more recently, exactly the kind of viral AI video content this script opened by debunking. In March of 1997, thousands of people across Arizona reported witnessing a massive V, shaped formation of lights moving silently across the night sky in an event that became known as the Phoenix Lights, later addressed publicly by then Arizona Governor Fife Symington, who initially mocked the reports at a press conference before admitting years afterward that he himself had witnessed the same unexplained object and found it genuinely inexplicable, even as the Air Force attributed at least part of the reported activity that night to flares dropped during a training exercise at a nearby range, an explanation many original witnesses have continued to dispute as insufficient to account for everything they personally saw. In November of 2006, United Airlines ground crew and pilots at Chicago O'Hare International Airport reported a metallic, disc-shaped object hovering silently above a terminal gate for several minutes before it reportedly shot upward through cloud cover, leaving a visible hole, an incident the Federal Aviation Administration officially attributed to a weather phenomenon after review, a conclusion that airport employees involved in the original reports have publicly and repeatedly disputed ever since. Stepping back across this entire 79-year timeline, from Kenneth Arnold's flying saucers in 1947 through Grush's sworn congressional testimony in 2023, a genuinely consistent pattern emerges, one that's far more interesting than either a confirmed cover-up or a simple dismissal would be. Nearly every individual case, examined closely and honestly, resolves into one of a small number of categories. Classified human technology being mistaken for something otherworldly, exactly as happened repeatedly around Area 51, and according to the government's own later account, at Roswell itself. Conventional atmospheric, astronomical, or aviation phenomena, flares, balloons, unusual cloud formations, and aircraft lighting, misidentified under conditions of genuine confusion, distance, and speed that make confident visual identification difficult even for trained observers. Documented, forensically confirmed hoaxes, like the Majestic 12 papers, that took on a life of their own once released into a research community already primed to want to believe them. And finally, a genuinely small residual category of encounters, including elements of the 2004 Nimitz incident that credentialed military witnesses, corroborating instrument data, and now the government's own official reporting apparatus have all been unable to conclusively explain using any of the above categories, which is precisely the honest, narrow space where legitimate ongoing government investigation, congressional hearings, and serious scientific interest continue to exist today, entirely separate from the much larger volume of thoroughly resolved or debunked cases that get folded back in indiscriminately by viral content, looking for a bigger, more dramatic story than the genuine residual mystery actually supports on its own. Whether the U.S. military has been in direct contact with aliens since 1947. The honest, sourced answer is that no government agency, no congressional hearing, and no officially released document has ever confirmed direct contact with extraterrestrial beings, and the Pentagon's own dedicated UAP investigation office has explicitly and repeatedly stated it has found no verifiable evidence supporting claims of recovered alien technology or biological material. At the same time, it is entirely documented fact that the United States government has run continuous, formally funded investigative programs into unexplained aerial phenomena since 1947, that credentialed military pilots have testified under oath to encountering objects exhibiting flight characteristics they could not explain using known technology, and that a decorated former intelligence official testified under oath before Congress, on the record, that non-human biological material had been recovered from crash sites, testimony the Pentagon has since publicly disputed rather than confirmed. That's the genuinely strange, genuinely unresolved story sitting underneath this topic, playing out entirely through real congressional hearings, real declassified Navy footage, and real dueling official government statements. No invented chatbot required. And honestly, no invented chatbot could improve on it.